Next up, we have Tara Vaughn with the University of Kentucky, and I'm going to get out of the way quickly because she's going to talk to you about cut flowers.
Good morning. Oh, that is lively. That is good to hear. Thank you, guys. So as Jody said, my name is Tara Vaughn. I'm the Commercial Ornamentals Extension Associate for UK. I've been in this role for about 3 years, and it has evolved from me just focusing on nursery crops, but now I also work with Christmas trees, and as of about a year now, cut flowers as well. I am a cut flower grower myself for the last 4 years. Is this on? Yeah? Okay. Cut flower grower myself for the last 4 years, actually just about 10 minutes down the road. So that's why I was asked to start bringing some of my expertise, I guess you could say, at least that's what they thought, to the extension table. And I'm excited to talk to you guys. Does anybody in here currently grow cut flowers for profit? Okay. Does anybody currently grow cut flowers for hobby or for yourself, your own enjoyment, to give away to family and friends, all that kind of stuff? Okay, more. Is there anybody in here that doesn't grow cut flowers but is thinking about growing cut flowers with a production and a profit mindset? Okay. And then I'm assuming the rest of you that didn't raise your hand are just here because you wanted to hear about cut flowers. All right. Well, we'll get started. Bear with me a little bit. I had some crud earlier this week that's still working its way out of my chest, so might have to stop and cough a little bit here and there. I apologize. Okay, so most people think of starting their cut flower season in the spring, and it's true that most of the time it does start in the spring. But if you wait to start everything until the beginning of a season in the spring, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed because you've got so many tasks on your plate. You've got all of these things and many more. You're thinking about starting seeds. You're thinking about maybe buying plugs in from a broker so that you can directly plant those transplants in the ground. You're planning what you want to grow and the colors of flowers that you want to grow. You're prepping those beds for planting. If you are growing early spring flower bloomers, maybe you're already cutting and arranging and managing your markets and, figuring out your sales outlets and all that sort of stuff. So it's easy to feel very overwhelmed in the spring. Let's talk about some tasks that you can manage throughout the season so that your workload in the spring is not so heavy. All right. So we're going to break it out, spring, summer, fall, and winter, starting in spring, because as we've mentioned, it tends to feel and maybe be the most busiest to most folks. So let's talk a little bit about seed starting. For those of you who do grow cut flowers currently, are you seed starting? Are you direct seeding? Are you buying in plugs? Anybody doing a mixture of all three? Anybody doing your own seed starting or direct seeding? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about seed starting. When people are thinking about starting seeds in the spring, we're generally talking about starting seeds for planting after the last frost date. And I'm assuming most of everyone in here understands what after the last frost date means. You can also order traditional plug trays. Has anybody tried soil blocking? It's a different method. Good. Okay, winter sowing. I didn't include that one in here, but that's another good method that's a little bit easier, low maintenance, and you let Mother Nature handle most of it. Yes, that's a good one. I unfortunately didn't include it in here. I don't have any pictures to show you guys today, but we will talk a little bit about soil blocking. So I put two things on here. This is two common things that we see on the back of seed packets. One is sow your seeds or start your seeds as soon as the soil can be worked. So this is for direct seeding. And what does that mean, as soon as the soil can be worked? Well, really that means as long as your ground is not frozen and you are far enough along in the spring that there's not fear of your ground staying thoroughly frozen for an extended period of time, you can start putting those seeds out there as soon as the ground can be worked. So a lot of times that's even as early as March for flowers that fall under the cold hardy or hardy annuals category. And then after the last frost are for seeds that are more of our tender annuals category. There are things that if it does frost on them, it typically will kill them, or it will at least stunt them and set them back a little bit until they get some new growth put on them. So those are two things to look at: is do your seeds need to be planted or sowed after the last frost date, or can you plant it as soon as the soil can be worked? Another thing that I will add on that is that generally, if the seed packet says to get them out there as soon as the soil can be worked, you don't want to wait until after the last frost date, because those seeds are actually looking for a cool period to get established, and a lot of them need cooler temperatures to germinate. So that's really important. As soon as the soil can be worked doesn't mean wait later. It means go ahead and get it done now, because these seeds like the cold. And then I have an example here. So let's say your seed packet says start your seeds 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost date. So you want to take the average last frost date. For here in Frankfurt this year, the average, they said the average frost date was April 21st. Now, we all know that varies a little bit because it can be 70 degrees for the majority of the month of April some years. And last April, our last frost date here in Frankfurt was April 2nd, and so it was really early. But you just want to use that as a general time frame for how early you need to start your seeds. So if you're starting seeds indoors, that's something that you need to pay attention to, is how early do you need to start them so that they are ready to transplant once you reach that A-OK time point of hopefully our last frost being passed. Now, we also know that it has snowed on Derby Day before in Kentucky, so also take that into account. That can swing the other way. Have a game plan in place to keep your eye on the extended forecast, and once that April 21st date rolls along, just keep an eye on things and make sure it looks okay, and maybe possibly have some frost cloth ready to cover those tender seedlings if we do get a late frost in May. And then also something that you need to take into account when starting your seeds and planning out the timing is the germination time. So most seed packets will say something like 10 to 14 days for germination if it's something that takes a little bit longer. Some of them say 2 to 4 days. It really is just very dependent upon the type of seed that you're starting. But that germination period is not included in the 4 to 6 weeks. So if you have a seed that takes 14 days to germinate, you need to add those 14 days on top of the 4 to 6 weeks to do your calculations of figuring out when you need to seed start based on when your goal for planting the flowers out is. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about soil blocking. Soil blocking is a really neat alternative to using traditional plug trays. There's many advantages of soil blocking, but there are some disadvantages as well. So one of them is that it is space saving. That is probably everyone's tip-top number one thing they say they love about soil blocking. Maybe they don't have a lot of indoor space to work with, and they want to save space. These soil blocks in this photo, you can see the seed. They're really small. Each individual block is about this big. It's 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch. So you can start seeds in a really small space. You can fit a lot of those soil blocks in the same footprint as a traditional 10-20 size plug tray. It also uses less inputs because you're using a lot less medium. Generally, you can see faster germination as well because the soil temperature in that little bitty block is a little bit more uniform versus in a plug tray. You will see faster seedling growth, and air pruning of roots is another good advantage. But the disadvantages are that they require more attention, meaning that because they are open air and they are much smaller, they dry out much, much faster than traditional plug trays. And oftentimes when people say, I've decided soil blocking is not for me, is because they either can't remember, or they're too busy, or their house sitter didn't pay enough attention to the soil blocks, and they dried out and those little seedlings die. So you definitely have to make sure that these guys stay watered. You usually have to water them about 3 times more frequently than you do traditional plug trays. And another thing is the seedlings can get stunted in these little bitty blocks because they don't have much to grow in. So if you're choosing to use soil blocks, you really have to have your planting area ready to go as soon as those seedlings have reached the desired size in that soil block. They need to go in the ground, or they're going to get stunted very quickly. Yep. Yes, so I didn't cut them myself. So there is a little tool. This is the size of a 20-cell soil blocker. That is the smallest one you can get. So it's about this big, and there are 20 soil blocks in it. There are companies out there, particularly Swift Blocker is the one who pioneered this a couple years ago, that you can get a soil blocker that is the size of a normal 120 plug tray or 1020 plug tray, and it will create 200 or 128, whatever size you choose when you're buying the soil blocker, and it will push out 200 of those at once. You don't create it yourself. It does it for you. Basically, you stuff this little blocker full. It's got the indents for where you're putting the seed and the divisions between the blocks themselves, and then you just push it out of this blocker, and it plops onto your tray or whatever you're wanting to use, and it's really easy. It's really easy to use. You do. You can buy all sorts of different mixtures for soil blocking. There are some very high dollar ones out there that are advertised as the best thing ever, and they are good, but there are a lot of more cost-effective things that you can use. But the biggest thing is because these blocks are so small, you can't use anything that's super chunky. So like a regular bale of Pro Mix sometimes might have too many twigs in it. You might have to sift it first. It does. It depends on the type that you get, but yes, you can find a lot of information on soil blocking. It does require a certain mixture, as in make sure it doesn't have huge chunks of perlite and twigs and peat moss in it, and it does require a certain media to water ratio for the blocks to stick together and be the right consistency. But all of that stuff is easily Googleable. So if you are interested in soil blocking, you can find all those things online really, really easily. Okay. So also talking about spring, tulips are a welcome sight in the spring. A lot of people, especially cut flower growers that are doing their business for profit, are incorporating tulips into their operations because they are some of the earliest blooming spring flowers. They're very colorful, and they're a welcome sight. People get really excited, consumers get really excited to see tulip bunches in the spring. And so there are early, mid, and late spring blooming varieties. The early ones, again, we all know Kentucky weather can vary, so just generally, the early ones will bloom in late March and early April, and then the late varieties will bloom at the very latest by Mother's Day, but most of them have bloomed by the end of April with the weather that we've been having in Kentucky for the last several years. And a good thing about tulips is that if you pull the tulips with the bulb on, which is standard practice in cut flowers, you can hold them in a cooler for 1 to 3 weeks. Store them with the bulb on dry, not in water. You can cut the bulb off and rehydrate those tulips in water, and they're good to go. So a lot of people really like that they can grow tulips, store them for that period of time, and still use them for sales later. Particularly, a lot of people are doing that for Mother's Day. If the tulips have bloomed by the end of April, they can hold them for another week or two and have tulips for Mother's Day, and that's a very popular thing. But that 1 to 3 week period in the cooler does vary a little bit by varietal differences. Some tulips hold in the cooler better than others, and it also depends on your humidity conditions in your cooler. If the cooler is too dry, it will actually dry out the buds and the blooms of the tulips, and that can cause breakage when you go to rehydrate your tulips. So humidity has to be spot on for this to be accomplished. Okay, another thing in the spring is spring planted hardy annuals. So this is the classification of plants that want and actually need to be established in cold periods so that they can give off good, strong stems and good sized blooms. They need that cold for their roots to be established and to produce well. So many of the spring of the hardy annuals can be planted even as early as mid-February, which sounds crazy. A lot of people are like, well, I don't want to be out there planting in February. It's cold. But again, it's Kentucky, and a lot of times that does throw us some decent weather days in February, and that's a time to get out there and plant your spring planted hardy annuals. Now, if you're doing that, you do need to have some protection available. I recommend, if you're planting in February, at minimum, you have some row cover of Ag 30 or the 1 ounce weight frost cloth fabric. You can see here in this picture, this is actually one, there is Ag 30 frost cloth under this top layer of plastic. And we'll talk just briefly in the next couple slides about some differences in frost cloth and plastic. But then most of them can be planted by late March and early April without having to worry about extreme protection such as added plastic. You can put a light layer of frost cloth on these babies if it drops below about 30 degrees, and they'll be fine. It does really depend on your microclimate. My farm, for example, sits in a little bit of a low swell in the ground, and so we get more heavy frost there than a lot of my farming peers around me. And so I have to take that into account when I'm choosing my planting date and what degree of protection I want to give my plants. Okay, ordering for next season. You're already thinking about ordering for next season in the spring? It's crazy, but you do, especially for things like fall planted bulbs. Spring bulbs, which includes tulips, for example, they have to be ordered in wholesale quantities in April. If you order them by the end of April, you're actually probably too late. The market keeps getting more and more competitive. A lot of people are ordering 2026 tulip bulbs in March of 2025, and so you really have to plan ahead. You have to order for the next season while the current season is in bloom. Dahlias are another popular cut flower, and even though those babies are not going to bloom until usually starting in August, a lot of people will buy their dahlia tubers in the early spring or even in the fall. So right now people are buying tubers that will not be planted until next May for bloom next August. So it's something that you really got to plan ahead and think about early. You got to order from your plugs. If you're ordering from a broker, you need to order in advance. So back in October, I ordered Lisianthus plugs for my farm that will be here next April, and they will not start blooming until next July. And I checked just earlier this week, and a lot of those Lisianthus plugs from several brokers are already sold out for next season. So you really got to plan ahead on ordering things. Perennial plants generally can be ordered year-round, but fall is the best time to plant them, but it is a little bit dependent upon species. Okay, so let's talk about some summer tasks. I'm also going to check my time. All right, so summer, you're drowning in flowers. It feels like nothing, you're getting nothing accomplished other than cut, 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 sell, cut, 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 sell. But this is the season of focusing on streamlining your operations and tweaking what you do on day to day to make things more efficient Work smarter and not harder is a huge thing, because as you guys are aware, with whatever type of horticultural farming you are doing, it is very labor intensive and also physically demanding. So this is the time to streamline things, figure out what is working and what is not, how you can accomplish what you're trying to do in a more efficient way, and also take notes. I tell people to do this all the time. If you say, man, I'll write this down at the end of the season, I'm too busy right now, you're not going to remember. So write it down as you're going so that you can think about in the off season how you can do things a little bit better. And also fine-tuning your sales outlets. Maybe you thought you could sell these beautiful Lisianthus in one sales avenue and it's just not working out for you. What else can you do to put these flowers in the consumer's hands in a way they want them? So work on those things and think about those things while you're in the midst of doing it. Okay, another summer task is succession planning, especially for something like sunflowers. If you want sunflowers all throughout the season, you're going to have to replant them. You're going to have to succession plant them. On our farm, we plant them every 10 days or so that we have a continual harvest of sunflowers all the way from June until, believe it or not, I had some super late planted ones that I was for sure the frost was going to take out this year, but as you guys know, we've had a very, very mild October and November, and I was actually cutting sunflowers just last week. So every 7 to 10 days, make sure you are sowing more so that you can have a continual harvest if you want them. Stock is another example, but that is an early spring flower. And then you'll also want to succession plant some cut and come again flowers like zinnias and cosmos, because if you guys have grown them, you know that there's not much you can do to prevent zinnias from getting powdery mildew. It doesn't matter how hard you try, how you baby them, what you put on them, they're going to get powdery mildew. It's just the way of it. And when those plants have had powdery mildew for so long, you are now getting blooms that are compromised greatly on vase life. They might still look decent when you cut them, but the vase life for your customer is going to be drastically decreased, and we don't want that. So you need to have successions of things like zinnias and cosmos planted. So when your first planting is getting tired on its 3rd or 4th week of production, you have a new succession coming into bloom, and you can still provide good, plump, healthy flowers to your customers. Any questions on succession planning? I know it can be confusing to people who are thinking about this concept for the first time. No questions? Good. Okay, and then in the summer, you're seed starting again? What? But yes, you are seed starting again if you want to plant fall planted hardy annuals. So this is the same classification of plants that we talked about for the very early spring planting in February, but there are some of those plants that can actually be planted in the fall, overwintered under tunnels like in that picture that I had on the screen earlier, with frost cloth and plastic, and they will give you even typically better quality. And when I say better quality, we're talking about larger, more robust blooms and taller, thicker, stronger stems. So you'll have that better quality bloom, and then you'll also have earlier bloom in the spring. So you need to start these plants that will be fall planted in the summer. Or if you're going to do plugs ordered in from a broker, you need to order them in the spring or the summer so the broker can be growing those in time for you to plant. So you also want to determine your target planting date. Generally, planting is done from mid-September to mid-November. I always encourage people to aim for mid-September because a lot of times that gets delayed, especially for the people who are growing fall flowers. They're still cutting, arranging, selling, and a lot of times planting things on time gets put on the back burner because I've got flowers in the field still. They have to be my priority. Totally get it. Aim for mid-September and try to get them planted at latest by mid-November. The reason we want to plant them as early as mid-September is because we want to put these plants in the ground and let them get some good root establishment before we start getting into consistently cold weather. Now, these plants do like the cold weather, but if we have some really harsh weather come in November early, it can kill some of these plants if they're not established in the ground quite enough. You can plant them as late as mid-November, but if you're planting them in mid-November, you're basically going to want to keep these babies covered under those hoops of frost cloth and plastic, so you're artificially creating a warmer environment that allows them to get that root establishment that they didn't get from being planted in mid-September. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a much more labor-intensive and difficult to understand category of plants, but the blooms that you get from them in the spring are very rewarding and well worth it. I've had a lot of people tell me that once they dove in and just gave hardy annuals a try, they will never go back. So if you're interested and you want more information, just let me know. Okay, fall tasks, another big time for tasks. In the fall, generally, we're preparing our beds for winter. We're taking out our summer annuals that were in the field. Now, I will point out that you don't have to take out your summer annuals that are in the field in the fall if you do not wish. There are some advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages are that you have got the beds cleared, you've got an opportunity to prep those beds for spring planting before spring rolls around, and your spring self will thank you for that. But some of the disadvantages are that a lot of times those dead plants after the season are the home for insects and small animals over the winter. We've ripped out a lot of plants from my field, and I found a lot of praying mantis egg sacs, for example. And so if we're removing that from the field, we're also removing our good beneficial insect egg sacs, such as praying mantises. And maybe we don't necessarily want to do that. And so there's pro and cons, so just, something to think about, whatever works best for your schedule and your operation. Fall is also the best time to soil test. You can soil test at any time of year, but fall is a good time to get your soil test in so that you have time to get it back, so that if you need to amend your beds with some sort of fertilizer, you can do that. And you can allow those fertilizers to hang out over the winter, and everything will be ready to go for you come early spring. And then a lot of people will cover their fields to reduce weed pressure over the winter. So right here, this is a large silage tarp, but it doesn't have to be a silage tarp. Those are often very expensive if you're buying one online, for example. I've seen other people use old billboard signs, which is a good way to recycle, and they're a lot cheaper than buying silage tarps. I thought you were waving 5 minutes at me. So cover to reduce weed pressure all winter, and again, that's something that your spring self will thank you for. If you cover crop on your farm, this is also the time to put in winter cover crops. You'll want to do that in the fall so that your cover crop can get established. It can do its thing over the winter, and then come spring, you'll mow it down. That's a method of terminating cover crop. It'll add nutrients, additional biomass, organic matter to your soil, and it will keep those soil microbes that we want to attract and keep in our soils alive and healthy, living on the roots of your cover crop throughout the winter. So cover cropping is good, and fall is a good time to put it in. Okay, it's the time to get down and dirty. So you have to do all these things before the winter weather sets in, because nobody wants to be out there like the weather has been the last couple days doing these tasks if you don't have to. So if you want to start new beds for spring flowers, the fall is the best time to do it. Go ahead and till that ground up. Go ahead and however you plan on starting those new beds, go ahead and do that in the fall so that the grass that you've tilled up, for example, can die over the winter, and your beds are ready to go in the spring. If you're going to break ground by solarizing, that is something that actually needs to be done in the summer, ideally. You want to put down your tarp or your billboard sign or whatever it is you're using on the new area that you're going to plant, ideally for anywhere as little as 2 to 3 months all the way up to 6 months so that you can really kill the vegetation underneath and also kill off the seed bank that's on the surface of the soil. It's best if you use solarization, so during the summer months the sun is really going to heat up under that black plastic, but you can still accomplish things by covering it all winter as well and starving that soil from water. And we do also get some sunny days in the winter, which will help a little bit. And prepping your beds, don't save this for the spring. A lot of times we get lots of spring rains and it's difficult to get out in the field. If you have time in the fall, it's best to put down your compost or any fertilizer that you want to put down. If you want to go ahead and lay your weed barrier in this photo, any irrigation you want to go ahead and put out. Try to accomplish as many of these tasks in the fall as you can so that you're not feeling so overwhelmed in the spring. Okay. We kind of already talked about this, so I'm going to skip ahead. Let's talk about frost cloth. Who in here uses frost cloth for anything on their farm? A couple people? Okay. So we might have some understanding of frost cloth, but we'll go through it real quick. Most of the time what's used in Kentucky is Ag 19 or Ag 30. Ag 19 provides about 4 degrees Fahrenheit of frost protection, which doesn't sound like much, but it actually makes a huge difference. And it allows the soil to stay warm, so those roots stay warm. And a lot of times, the ground, unless we have like an extended winter polar vortex like we did a couple years ago, generally, the ground underneath those hoops that are covered with frost cloth and plastic actually does not freeze all winter, or it will just lightly freeze on the top. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish by using the frost cloth. It is to protect the above ground vegetation, but it's more so to keep the soil warm so that the roots of your plant survives. Even if the above ground growth of your plant starts to look a little bit iffy and you think you planted all these plants in the fall and they just don't look that great come February, you're not sure if they successfully made it through the winter, those roots are generally still going to be alive and well underneath, and it just needs to put on new green growth above ground. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. If you're overwintering in the fall, I definitely recommend Ag 30. It's just a heavier weight, a couple more degrees of protection. So it's generally used for the fall plantings. If you're doing some late spring or even some early spring plantings, you could get away with the Ag 19. There is a little bit of a cost difference, so just something to consider. And then plastic is generally only used if you're going to fall plant. Generally, if we're doing spring plantings, we don't need a layer of plastic because we're not fighting the full winter temperatures that we get in January and early February. The thickness of plastic that you can use, we've got 4 mil, 6 mil, and 8 mil. Generally, I always recommend 6 mil. 4 mil can be a little bit too light if we get some harsh weather in the winter. The 8 mil, honestly, is just a little bit of overkill, in my opinion. So 6 mil is a really good one to get. On top of your frost cloth, the plastic is going to offer more temperature protection for your plants, but you want to make sure that plastic is not opaque. You still need to have light transmission through your frost cloth and through your plastic for your plants to make it and keep slowly photosynthesizing over the winter time. The frost cloth is breathable a little bit, but it does build up humidity underneath if you leave it down across the plants for too long. But if you're putting plastic on top, it is not breathable, and you definitely will build up humidity very quickly. So the thing you have to consider if you want to do this is these hoops have to be vented regularly or even completely taken off. We see it all the time, especially in the spring. Our days might get up to 50 degrees, but our nights are still getting down to 25. So if our nights are getting to 25, our plants have to be covered. But if we leave this on during a 50-degree day, it will get up into the 90s in those low tunnels, and it's very easy to steam your plants. So this is something you have to be dedicated to for covering and uncovering, or at minimum venting your tunnels so that that heat and humidity can escape the tunnel and you're not steaming your plants and creating a disease-friendly environment with high humidity and warm temperatures inside those tunnels. Any questions? Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. They're not using frost cloth, or it doesn't have to be like this brand. So Ag 19 and Ag 30 is a brand. It's Agribon. It doesn't have to be that brand if that's what you're like. Okay, so okay, it sounds like the same concept as frost cloth, just maybe a little bit more homemade and maybe just more resourcefully sourced. This is with plastic on top. So I wish I had included, now I'm wishing I had included a picture of just frost cloth, because you would be able to see that the frost cloth is more, oops, wrong way. You can see through it a lot more. Like this Ag 19, it's 85% light transmission. So it's a lot thinner. It looks like cloth. It sounds a lot more like what you're talking about, but I just didn't have a picture of it in here, unfortunately. This is with plastic on top, so it looks like complete, solid, non-cloth covering. But it sounds like they're using like the same concept of frost cloth that has been pieced together, or other types of cloth.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Is there going to be a big difference in frost cloth?
I think that the most important thing, it sounds like they pieced these pieces together. I think the most important thing is that it's pieced together well, so that there are not air gaps in between those pieces, because even the smallest of air gaps, even if, I keep going the wrong way, even if the plastic and the cloth is sealed along the ground here, one side it's sealed with purlins, junk that we found on our farm when we bought it, is what that is. But it's helpful for this. And then the other side we secure with sandbags. And so even if it's not secured at that ground level to where the cold winter air and wind can seep in, that is going to dramatically change the efficacy of this whole program. So I would say it's not necessarily the material you use. You do want it to be a little bit breathable if you're using cloth like that, and then you want it to be sealed well. So it sounds like it's probably still in the same efficacy ball game, but without really seeing it. We've also, in a pinch, when we've run out of frost cloth and I have a small section left or something, I raided my mom's old bedroom sheets linen closet, So things like that. The biggest thing is that the cloth, whatever you're using, cannot touch the plants. It needs to be held above the plants with something like these hoops, because if it's touching the plant, you will get basically freezer burn is what it is. So just make sure whatever you're using is not touching whatever you're trying to protect. All right, what time am I at? 6 minutes. We're gonna skip this. We're going to talk about some winter tasks. The main thing I always tell people to talk or think about during the winter is your marketing. You grew all these great, beautiful flowers during the season, but how well did you do at your marketing? We see a lot of people that grow flowers and then say, I wasn't able to sell them all, or I wasn't able to sell half of what I grew. What can I do better? So think about your marketing avenues, and we're going to have to quickly speed through this. So a popular option for cut flower growers is to have a CSA option. A lot of veggie growers already have a CSA option. Maybe you're wanting to start with flowers on your veggie farm. You can add in a small cut flower bouquet as a part of your CSA option. If you're wanting to start a flower-only CSA, most of the common options that people use in Kentucky are to have a monthly subscription where you get one bouquet a month during the flower season. You've also got bi-weekly and weekly. And then some of them offer add-ons. So add-ons might be as part of a veggie CSA or part of a meat CSA. Add-ons can also be once the fresh cut flower season has ended, people will give their customers a dried flower bouquet or a pumpkin arrangement. Have you guys seen those pumpkin flower arrangements? They're very trendy the last few years. Something like that. So the largest perk of a CSA is that the flowers you're growing each week are pre-sold. Your customer is already lined up. The flowers you're growing and you're cutting are pre-sold. They're going to a home. Another perk is that one sale, the sale of one CSA, is the sale of many bouquets in one sale. So you're not trying to sell individual bouquets through Facebook Marketplace or through your farmer's market. You're making the one sale and you've got many bouquets sold throughout your season. Flower farmers typically have their subscriptions on sale during the off season. So a lot of flower farmers are advertising 2025 subscriptions right now so people can gift them as Christmas presents. And so they are generating income for themselves during the off season where they're not actually selling fresh cut flowers at the moment. Farmers markets is a popular one. I will say, because we have had such a rise of cut flower growers in the state, that farmers markets are much more competitive to get into for flower growers because typically a market, if it's a smaller market especially, will only accept one, maybe two vendors. Even the largest markets in the state typically only have 3 or 4, possibly 5. So they're competitive to get into, and it is a regular commitment that you have to be there, especially on the weekends. So if you're not willing to give up weekends, you've got kids' soccer games or something like that on Saturday mornings, this might not be the option for you. You can have a farm stand on your farm. The biggest thing with a farm stand is you must be zoned properly and you must have the proper permit for it. Do not overlook the importance of this because your county will find out, and generally they will make a big deal out of it. And you have to have a farm location where people are going to be willing to drive to your farm. You cannot be too rural or people might not be willing to drive to you. For sake of time, we're going to skip this one. This is another really popular one. People are craving experiences, especially since COVID. People want to go to a farm and have an experience of some sort. So if you have a place on your farm where you can host people and you have a really creative side, you can come up with just about any type of workshop. It can be something as simple as the workshop is people coming to your farm, going out and cutting their own blooms from the field, and then putting them together with you leading an arrangement or design sort of course. What was that? Those are the pumpkins that I was talking about, yes. So this is another really popular one for the fall time. I've seen people do sip and paint, cookie decorating at the farm while cutting flowers, cut flower pressing, candle making, all sorts of things. But you do have to have a people person, and you do have to be a people person, and you have to have a space for this. U-pick is also an option. Wholesale is an option if you have a wholesale outlet near you and you are growing in bulk enough to be able to provide wholesale. The biggest drawback is that your quality especially stem length, really must be top-notch for this market. It is more difficult to enter. And here's a few other options. You can take custom orders, DIY buckets. If you're wanting to enter the wedding or event industry, there's a lot of money in that, but it does require expertise. Dried flowers, photography fields, you can really get creative with it. All right, and if you want to keep learning about cut flowers, the UK CCD Center for Crop Diversification website has tons of resources available that you can go find on there, videos, written publications, all sorts of things. So we're out of time. And thank you for coming. If you have more questions, I'll stick around and be around, and I'd be happy to answer.